In 2022, inflation in the United States hit 9%. In Nigeria, it crossed 20%. In Argentina, it exceeded 90%. In Zimbabwe, it reached hundreds. Governments called it a cost of living crisis. Central banks called it transitory. Economists debated its causes on television panels for months. Meanwhile, ordinary families quietly made the same calculation, quietly, without anyone asking, and concluded that their money was buying less. Their savings were shrinking, and nobody in power seemed to be experiencing the same problem they were. They were right, and the reason why is not complicated once you understand the architecture. Most people think inflation is like bad weather. It arrives, it affects everyone, it passes, you endure it. That is not what inflation is. Today on Wealth Map, we are mapping inflation, not the version the textbooks describe, but the version that is actually operating on your wealth right now. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly who inflation hurts, who it helps, and which side of that equation you are currently on. Start with this. The inflation number you see on the news, 7%, 9%, whatever figure the government releases, is not the inflation rate you actually experience. Every government measures inflation using something called a consumer price index, a basket of goods and services, representing what a typical household buys. The composition of that basket, the weighting of each item, the methodology for calculating price changes, all of it is determined by the same governments whose economic performance is being judged by the result. Over the decades, the methodology for calculating inflation in most developed economies has been revised repeatedly. Housing cost, the single largest expense for most ordinary households, have been progressively underweighted. Substitution effects are built in, assuming that when steak becomes too expensive, people switch to chicken. So the real cost of living has not risen. Hedonic adjustments reduce the MEASURED price of technology products even when the cash price rises. The result is an official inflation figure that is almost always lower than what ordinary people actually experience when they pay rent, buy food, and fill up their cars. This is not a conspiracy, it is a methodology. But the methodology has consequences because official inflation figures determine wage negotiations, benefit adjustments, and the public perception of economic management. When the official figure says 4%, but your actual experience says 8%, you are not confused. You are just measuring the right thing. Now here is the structural reality that almost no mainstream outlet explains clearly. Inflation does not destroy all wealth equally. It destroys cash. When inflation runs at 8% a year, every $100 sitting in a savings account earning 2% interest loses $6 of real purchasing power every 12 months, quietly, invisibly, without a single headline. The people who hold the largest proportion of their wealth in cash are overwhelmingly those with the least wealth, ordinary workers, people living paycheck to paycheck, households in developing economies where access to investment accounts is limited or non-existent. Now consider what inflation does to assets. Property prices typically rise with inflation or ahead of it. Stock prices, which represent ownership of real businesses with real assets and real pricing power, historically outpace inflation over time. Gold, commodities, and real assets generally hold their value or appreciate when currency purchasing power falls. The wealthy hold assets, the poor hold cash. Inflation erodes cash and inflates assets. This means every inflationary episode is simultaneously a cost of living crisis for people without assets and a wealth building event for people who own them. Not by accident, not randomly, structurally, every single time. The 2020 to 2022 period made this mechanism more visible than it had been in a generation. In response to the COVID pandemic, central banks around the world created trillions of dollars of new money and deployed it through financial markets. Asset prices surged immediately. The S&P 500 recovered its losses and hit record highs within months. Property markets in every major city exploded upward. The net worth of the world's billionaires increased by over $5 trillion in the first year of a global pandemic that pushed hundreds of millions into poverty. Then the inflation arrived in consumer goods, food, energy, rent, the things ordinary people cannot avoid buying. By the time ordinary households felt the full weight of rising prices, the asset-owning class had already locked in extraordinary gains. The inflation that the poor experienced as a crisis, the wealthy had already converted into capital appreciation. The mechanism ran exactly as it always has. Most people just noticed it more clearly than usual. So, where does this leave you? The answer is not to panic. It is not to abandon cash entirely. It is to understand the one principle. that changes your position in this equation permanently. Every hour your savings sit in cash, they are working against you in an inflationary environment. Every asset you own, property, index funds, a business, anything that generates real returns above the inflation rate is working for you. The difference between these two positions is not income. It is not intelligence. It is not luck. It is understanding which side of the inflation equation you are on and making a deliberate decision to move. The wealthy have always known this. They learned it early, applied it consistently, and compounded the advantage across generations. Now you know it too. This is Wealth Map. We map the systems that shape your financial life, whether you understand them or not. The only difference understanding makes is what you do next. Subscribe, because the next map shows you how the people who built these systems protect themselves from them, and how you can do the same.